Hey guys, it's Shaena. I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. This is the series where I just chat about the last 10 books that I read. It's pretty chill. The first book I have to talk about, so it's The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nghi. This was one of my most anticipated releases of the year. It's a retelling of The Great Gatsby told through Jordan Baker, who's a side character in The Great Gatsby. It reimagines her as a queer Vietnamese adoptee. I've never read the original Great Gatsby. I think it's one of those books that you usually read in school, but it just wasn't on my high school curriculum, and I just don't really pick up classics that often. And I was like, I think this is how I want to experience The Great Gatsby. I don't think I want to experience The Great Gatsby in its original form. This sounds like how I would rather experience The Great Gatsby. I have really mixed, complicated feelings on this book, but I genuinely think that the right person, this would be an absolute knock out of the park, and I think the things that held it back for me are very much to my own fault. In my opinion, this doesn't really stand as a work on its own. It's very much The Great Gatsby told through Jordan's eyes. I guess I kind of wanted her to have her own story in the world of The Great Gatsby, but it really did feel like it was her on the periphery of The Great Gatsby telling that story, which I guess kind of mirrors the form of The Great Gatsby itself, where it's told through the witness, which is, I guess, quite clever. It was just her being periphery to this famous plot line, and she didn't really have her own story until quite late in the book. A lot of the characters from the original, Jay and Nick and Daisy, I felt like I didn't get fully developed characterization from them. I feel like those characters aren't really developed in this book. I feel like in many ways you're meant to read The Great Gatsby, experience those fully developed characters, and then come read this as a way of opening up the world. I don't think you're meant to read this on its own without having read The Great Gatsby. I felt like Jordan's character was so interesting, and she had so much potential, and so many aspects of her world and her life and her character, the magic stuff, almost were being held back by the original Great Gatsby elements. I almost felt like they were hindering her story, because honestly, I thought she was more interesting than any of the Great Gatsby stuff going on. Premising of this book is amazing. Talk about a book with amazing conceptualization and amazing premising. If you've read The Great Gatsby and it's a book you love, which I know for a lot of people is among their favorite books, you really need to read this. Whereas for me, it felt like I was getting half of a story, but almost the wrong half. I felt like I was getting the Great Gatsby half told through Jordan's eyes. I wanted her story told through the world of the Great Gatsby, because I honestly thought she was the most interesting thing on the page. And I just kind of felt like maybe she was being almost hindered by the original Great Gatsby elements, because she had to spend time observing them rather than just having her own story, which was, to me, more compelling. Very cool book, really well conceptualized, really well premised, really well written, well rendered setting and world. I do fully support the queerification of The Great Gatsby. So next up I read Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder. This book follows a very ambitious artist who puts her career on hold to raise her son, and she's feeling really worn down and exhausted by motherhood, and she starts turning into a dog. It's in many ways extremely bizarre. This is one of those books where I was I don't know what that was, but I did like it. It's very clever in its blend of beast and person and how they collide and how that reflects in the narrator's thoughts. Quite visceral. I mean, this transformation into dog is handled in a very physical way, which I think the book needs. This isn't just a psychological transformation, it's a physical transformation, and it's one you really do feel on the page. I felt, and I think this is how I feel about a lot of books that are marketed as feminist works, that the actual points on feminism were really not that new at all. Not that it wasn't a story worth telling. I don't know if it really brought something new to the table in terms of a feminist commentary. There were a few points throughout the middle where I felt that her progression into becoming a dog kind of stilted. It wasn't really moving forward continually, and the motion of the plot is very much her transformation. This transformation is the plot, and so when it felt like she wasn't descending further into this dog transformation, I felt like then the plot was stagnating. This is a really wild premise that the author just went for. One of the things I admire the most about this is that the author was able to carry it for a whole book, because this is the kind of premise I hear it and I think it would be a short story. And sometimes I think with those kind of premises that feel a bit more short story-y, when you read it as a novel, you're like, man, that would have been better as a short story. And I do think this would have been an amazing short story. I'd actually be curious to know if it was maybe originally based on a short story or something. It really did work as a novel. It didn't feel bloated. It really dove into that concept. And it really required a very deep dive into that concept, I think, to sustain something so bizarre, but also in some ways kind of simple. Very weird, but fun and strange, and I did actually really quite enjoy this. Alright, so then we have some poetry. Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night by Morgan Parker. So this is actually Morgan Parker's debut, but I believe it was like re-released this year. I've noticed a few comments on these videos where people are like, man, you always rate poetry really high. And it is true. I feel like most of the poetry that I read, I rate 4 or 5 stars. Poetry is often the highest rated books in my videos, and I just wanted to quickly explain why I believe that is. First of all is because I'm not a poet. I feel like most of the poetry that I read I genuinely love, but I'm not nitpicking it. And honestly, I wish I could read fiction more like that. I'm really only ever rating poetry purely on vibes. And the other reason is because with poetry, I almost exclusively pick up poetry that is recommended by my friends who are poets. I usually pick up the books or the authors that they speak of the absolute most highly. So in many ways, I feel like I really do read like la creme de la creme of poetry. Like I really get the best out there because my friends who are poets who read a ton of poetry, I then read like the handful of collections that they recommend the most highly. So that's just like a quick, I think, theory on why I tend to rate a lot of poetry 5 out of 5, which I did rate this 5 out of 5, by the way. And it's not because I don't know what I'm talking about. This is amazing. One thing that I think I have experienced in Morgan Parker's poetry before, but that really stood out to me in this collection, is this kind of like very intimate humor. Like, I think she's quite funny and quite clever, and because I think it adds like a really nice contrast and emotional texture to the emotion or the more intense aspects of the poetry. There's kind of this like very intimate cleverness to the poems where it doesn't feel like jokes that you make for a stage or for an audience. It almost feels like humor that you use within your own mind or among your friends. What I wrote in my notes was effortless to read, yet complex. How? So then I read Kim Jiyoung, born 1982 by Nam-Joo. This is translated from Korean. This book was kind of like a sensation in Korea. So this book follows the title character, Kim Jiyoung. In the first chapter of the book, she starts basically like embodying the voices of these other women that she's known, and she's sent for psychiatric evaluation. And the rest of the book is basically a chronicle of her entire life and all of the sexism that she has experienced. Creates this main character, Kim Jiyoung, and kind of makes her like the Korean millennial every woman. Everything that she experiences is representative of like the sexism that the average Korean millennial woman will experience. And it's actually all cited. So when Kim Jiyoung experiences sexism in the workplace, or, you know, her brother experiences favoritism from parents, or she has to put in extra work around the house, these facts are all cited. So basically, you can't read this book and be like, well, it's just an anecdote. Very good example, I think, of the unity of form and concept. It reads almost like an article. The writing is extremely matter-of-fact, and I think that this is done to really great effect for the purpose of the book, because the purpose of the book isn't to be like, here's a very personal, you know, journey to the main character. It's actually to be like, no, this character is representative of the average Korean woman. It's actually a pretty distant narrative. It reads almost like fact. I think it's extremely intentional in how it showcases this fictional story as fact, because it is fact. In general, I thought that this was an extremely efficient piece of storytelling as well. This is a great example of a book that had a purpose, accomplishes its purpose in a very short amount of space, puts like evidence behind sexist microaggressions that otherwise are often maybe brushed off as anecdotal. It's a bit enraging for sure. Like, reading this, you do get a little upset because it's a lot of sexism. But it is very well done and very like intentionally constructed. So then I read There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko Tsumura. So this novel follows a woman who is basically just like on the hunt for the easiest possible job. She left her previous job because of burnout, and so now she's basically on the lookout for the easiest job possible. And the book is in, I think, 5 different sections that each follow her at a different job. I picked this up because I feel like that's the most relatable shit I've ever heard in my life. Like, this woman going into a job recruiter and being asked what her criteria is for a job, and her being like, I want the easiest job possible that requires the least brain power possible. Give it to me. Iconic. I get it. This definitely has some kind of cool, weird stuff in it. But I do think that the book is the strongest when it allows itself to be more surreal and allows itself to be more bizarre and kind of capitalize on like the surrealness of ennui. The book ranges from her doing jobs that are very low intensity, very little conflict, and the thing that eventually drives her away from them is just this small thing about the job eventually becomes unbearable, to jobs that are very weird and like she ends up investigating a cult. The weirder the book allowed itself to be, the stronger it was. And when it really allowed itself to put that ennui or boredom that she felt in life into more of like a surreal scenario to really showcase it. I felt like that was when the book shone. It didn't really linearly progress that way. It really just felt like 5 distinct episodes. I also felt that the ending revelation that the character has was really weak. In a plot like this, where it's just like kind of these distinct episodes, the character doesn't really have a goal. Like, her only goal is to find purpose, essentially. So it's extremely like meandery and stuff, which is fine. I like very meandery books. With this plotline, it was really working towards her having some kind of revelation, right, about what she truly wants, right? Because that's the core of the book, is that she's going through all these different jobs and they're not working for her, even though on paper it sounds like exactly what she wants. She's like, oh, that's exactly what I asked for. It requires very little thinking. It's super easy. It's close to my house. But then something about it doesn't work, right? So in the end, it feels like the book is leading towards her having a revelation about what she truly wants in life. And she does, but the end revelation I thought was extremely weak. Didn't really make use of all the potential there. So then I read Petra by Shaena Lambert. So this is a novel about a real person, Petra Kelly. She was one of the founders of the original Green Party in Germany in the 1980s, like during the Cold War, and they were like protesting nuclear weapons and stuff like that. And this is a fictionalized account of her life. This book was quite good. So this book is actually not told through Petra's point of view. It's told mostly through the eyes of this character, who I believe is a fictional creation, Manfred, who is kind of like an ex-lover but colleague of Petra's. I found the writing in this to be extremely engaging, like very distinct, interesting writing style, but super easy to read. Like the kind of writing style that just sucks you in. There were on occasion like a really weird line that I thought was kind of strange. This is very particular. Every once in a while I would get to a line that would kind of describe like either Petra's body or sexuality in a really weird way. It was the kind of line where I'd be like, that sounds like a line that only a man would write when writing about a female character. But then I was like, maybe this is super galaxy brain because the point of view character is a man. So maybe this is actually just extremely good writing and awareness of the character and how men think. This is also a pretty like non-linear book. It's very much like a jigsaw of many little pieces. The little pieces are super interesting. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of how they're all moving together in a forward way. Petra was actually the character we got the least emotional access to. She's very vibrant on the page, but in many ways was the character who felt the least real. Her motives and desires were certainly complex, but maybe not as accessible as all of the other characters, potentially just because we never get into her mind. But there were other side characters who I felt were almost more tangible. She was in many ways like the most difficult character to actually tap into. So then I read it, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. All I can say about this is I get it. I get it. I get the hype. I get the love. I get why everyone is obsessed with this book. So this book follows Richard. He's from kind of a humble family background in California, and he ends up getting accepted to this very like posh, hoity-toity, like liberal arts college in Vermont. And there he falls in with this group of fellow students who are studying Greek with kind of an enigmatic professor. They slowly descend into evil. When I first started reading this, I could definitely appreciate the beautiful writing, but at the very beginning, I was like, I didn't really care. I was kind of disinterested in what felt like, to me, maybe an overabundance of mundane detail. Like, we were really getting every single aspect and facet of Richard's life and just him going to college, and I was like, is this really important? And I wasn't that interested. At a certain point, I was just suddenly so engrossed that I could not put the book down. Then, the more I read, the more I just could not look away, and I could not put the book down. And it went from feeling, at the very beginning, what felt kind of slow-paced, and I was like, is this going to be a slog to get through, to something that I just literally, like, could not take my eyes off of. It is, for sure, an extremely rich depiction of the events. It really looks into every single facet, all of the characters involved, and every really detail that goes into the storyline, which at the very beginning felt too dense for someone who usually likes things a little more minimalist, but then as I got into it, it was just so engrossing. All I can really say about this is you were all right. I read 5 Little Indians by Michelle Good. So this book follows 5 different indigenous characters who all leave the same residential school and are kind of just now like set loose into the world with all of their trauma and absolutely, really, for most of them, nothing to really fall back on. The first thing I think of when I think about why this book works so well is that it flows. The writing flows, the storyline flows with an ease to it. Even though there are multiple different point of view characters, in many ways it's not like a structured 5, it's almost like a weaving in and out of different point of views and different storylines. There is definitely like quite a lot of dramatic content in this, but it's really not depicted gratuitously. Like, the focus is very much on the characters' healing and emotions. I would still definitely like look up a list of trigger warnings for this book. The way everything is depicted is very sensitive. Quite a lot of point of views, and there's definitely a pretty like blanket style rather than an individual voice for each character. I think on one hand that contributes to how easily the story can flow through different point of views, but I think in general I potentially would have liked a little bit of a different feeling to the different voices, just to like really distinguish the characters a little more. So then I picked up another book of poetry, Oculus by Sally Wen Mao. So like I said earlier, I really only rate poetry based on how much it made me have feelings, and this one did, so it gets a 5 stars from me. I think I tabbed every other page. I especially loved the Anime Wong poems. There's 2 sections of the book that are kind of a series of poems about Anime Wong. One thing I really liked about this collection was this collision of imagery of past and present. It felt like it was blending to create this strange alternate reality. I think if you like Soft Science by Franny Choi, you might really like this. They have similar themes and a similar vehicle. They're both about how Asian women are depicted in media, and they both have this like kind of speculative futuristic lean. The voices are very different. Franny Choi in Soft Science is extremely frenetic, whereas in Oculus, I think Sally Wen Mao her voice is quite measured. So if you liked one, I think you would really like the other. So the final book is All's Well by Mona Awad. So I'm a big fan of Bunny by Mona Awad, and I really just love how weird Mona Awad's work is. You know, I love a weird book, and she writes a weird book. So this book follows Miranda, who's a theater director, and before the start of the story, she fell off the stage during a production when she used to be an actress and injured her hip or her leg, I think, and has been dealing with pretty severe chronic pain from that accident ever since, and has basically been just like disregarded by the medical system. She's seen so many doctors and specialists and physical therapists, and none of them help, none of them listen to her, none of them believe her when she explains her pain. Many of them she feels just make it worse. She wants to put on a production of All's Well that ends well with her theater students, and they're really not that enthused or gifted theatrically. And they don't want to do All's Well That Ends Well, they want to put on Macbeth. It's just extremely bizarre. This book is extremely internal and voice-driven, especially for the first like half. Pretty much nothing happens externally, but it's extremely internally turbulent. The ending was wild. It reminded me a bit of Bunny in the ending in terms of it being extremely bizarre, and I didn't necessarily understand what was going on. I was still along for the ride. This will be a very interesting and fun read for you if you've ever worked in the theater, in the same way that Bunny was a very fun read if you've ever been in a writing program. And as someone who's done both, I have to ask Mona Awad why she keeps seeing me this way. Personally, I preferred Bunny. They're both very wacky to the point that sometimes you don't really know what's going on, but like you're enjoying the journey. I preferred Bunny more. The humor and satire pertained more to like a personal aspect of my life. Like I feel like most people are saying that they enjoy All's Well more, but they're both incredibly strange and incredibly bizarre. And this is one in particular is a great example of extremely voice-driven conflict. Like so much of the book's conflict is just in the character's internal narrative. It's pretty cool and very weird. So that's all for this episode of Recent Reads. I would love to hear what you have been reading lately. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.